This is TAZA, a knowledge series brought to you by Alliance for Coffee Excellence and Cup of Excellence.
Ethiopia, and the discussion around those coffees in particular was just really interesting and vibrant. So we wanted to bring all of the head judges together, and Darren invited some very special guests so that we could continue to kind of talk about anaerobic coffees and experimental process coffees, and bring all of the head judges together and kind of start to have a discussion to define for us in COE what makes a good anaerobic and what makes a good experimental process coffee. And so I guess that's really the kind of start of the discussion, is kind of asking that question, like all of us in our experience, what is it that makes a good experimental process coffee? Yeah. So that's kind of the start.
I think that, oh, sorry, please.
Yeah.
Well, I think that we did a little bit of statistical work yesterday in looking at the historical entries from Cup of Excellence, and Aaron put that together. And we've seen that, and we can put that up if you want to put that up for people to take a look at it. But I guess maybe we've just seen a definite proliferation, and I guess a little bit of a surprise that we saw anaerobics coming from Ethiopia, and because they were either classified as washed or natural. I think at the time when we saw the entries, we didn't really know for sure. Hold on, we've got to let Erwin in, and you know, also the fact that the differentiating maybe different processes within the anaerobic or even carbonic maceration, and just wanting to put that out as a general kind of conversation. But I don't know if we want to share that screen just to give people kind of an idea of, I think this was the PowerPoint.
Share.
There we go.
Guys, can you see it?
Yeah, can you go to full?
Yeah, let me figure this out. So I just put this together super quick yesterday as we were going through things. I think there's a lot more I'm sure I could have thrown together, but I thought this might be interesting maybe as a beginning part of the discussion, which is even before we had that great call last week with the Ethiopian judges. We've obviously noticed that in 2019 there was a spike, just naturally without the numbers, we could tell there was a spike of anaerobic or experimental coffee, if you will, coffee going into the auction. So this is only the auction lots, and this doesn't even actually show the coffees that participated that might have gotten eliminated prior to the auction itself. So this is just showing that in 2019, there was a steep kind of increase of 9 coffees going into the auctions. I just put this together of scores by year, basically. So you can kind of see as and I threw a little trend line in there. So you can see the trend is kind of going down, if you will, by score, but that could also obviously, and is also because of the 9 coffees that then entered the competition. So it's like you can kind of see the people who entered were able to score, you know, in 2015, were able to score fairly within like an 89 range, a little bit above 89. And then as more coffees have entered the competition, the trend is going down simply because there's more to average out, and there's obviously scores a lot, you know, going into the 92s all the way down to the 87s. So I thought that might just be an interesting view of the years and the scoring over time. We also took a look at price, you know, per pound by year. So this is the actual price in the auction. As you can see, the trend is slightly going up as we look at the averages, and it's just more of the trend looking at. And yeah, basically the coffees in 2015, they were receiving maybe $11.20, $15 per pound. This could tell us something about experimental coffees if we dig in deeper, or it could just tell us something about our auctions in general and very specific potentially to country as well, which we don't have ingrained in this chart. It's just pure, price by year. And then we were just looking at rank over time as well, just the ranks that they have achieved over the auction itself. So I just thought it might be interesting to take a look at. I know there's a lot more and would love to hear maybe take a look at this with another eye as we look at different countries and other trends that we can look at. But just really quickly, I put this together so that we might have a little bit of context going into this conversation and how much more relevant this conversation is now, even though we've been seeing this since 2015, and just how important it is for all of us to talk about it, basically. I think we all felt that last year, and, even with the health issues going on now, I thought it'd be good to come together and chat, because we even saw it, I'd say another interesting part that isn't in this presentation is, like, in 2015, it started. The auction lots that went to auction were in Costa Rica. In 2019, there were, I'm not even going to be able to remember, maybe 5 countries, maybe 4 countries that went to auction with anaerobic or experimental coffees. And that doesn't mean that, I'd say from our perspective, almost every single one of our auctions last year, or every single one of our competitions, actually had a coffee with an experimental coffee enter the competition. So and then the fact that in Ethiopia, the first time we ever did Cup of Excellence, that there are 2 anaerobic coffees, I believe, that actually went into the auction, is very telling for the trend that will continue, I'm sure, happening. So just wanted to share that, and I'll leave that with you guys.
And I'm curious, Paul, as head judge, I'm just curious how you interacted with those coffees, or just say a little bit about some of the flavor profiles that those coffees tended to kind of throw at the jury.
Well, I don't know. I was doing a lot of thinking regarding what was put up there, and it was interesting that when the stuff first came out, and I've seen this in the past, something new comes out first and people say, wow, that's really different. I have to give it a high score because it's really different. And then as you have more to compare with, it's like if you've got only one on the table, wow, that's really different. And you're either going to really like it or you're not going to really like it. If there are 2 or 3 on the table, then you can make some discrimination. Well, I like this one better. I don't like this one quite as well. And that seems to be maybe a part of the trend that's happening. But then when you get to the buying, it's like if people go in knowing that their particular markets really like those particular coffees, then, they're going to buy them. And that's, why you see as people become more familiar with the coffees, as the market becomes more familiar with the coffees, then perhaps they become more desirable. People know what they are, and they're not so strange and odd. But in terms of how people were relating to it, well, one of the reasons I proposed this call is because I noticed the national jury was kind of wondering, hey, what's going on here? And especially because we had so many different, the national jury was like from all over the country. And many of them, they were dealing with, a lot of new flavors anyway, or things that they weren't really used to cupping a lot of. And then this one was really throwing something in the works. And all the way through, it seemed like there was a spread in terms of some people really liked it, and some people just thought it was, hey, wait, what's going on here? And maybe they were not quite as enthusiastic about the coffee.
Great.
And in terms of what I thought about it, I'm comparing it to, well, the ones from Costa Rica, which were the original ones I tasted, and then a lot of the ones in Colombia. And I felt like sometimes the flavors of the process overcame the flavors of the origin. And that's kind of a red flag for me.
Mm-hmm.
If you start tasting more process than the actual coffee, it seems like at some point then all you're really grading is the process. How strong is the flavor, not how good is the flavor. And anyway, those were my hits on it.
Great. Scott Connery had a question to us about potentially some of the judges that were on the Ethiopia International, if they could either potentially share their scores or maybe some of the flavor. I know, Alex, we talked about this a little bit yesterday, and you had your flavor descriptions, and I do remember you sharing that with Aaron and I. If you wanted to kick that off, and then we could. Great.
Alex, you're muted there. You're muted.
There you go.
Thanks. So for coffee number 12, my flavor descriptions were pretty consistent across the board. And this was definitely one of my favorite coffees that I got to cup. It was just super distinct. The first time I cupped it, I think kind of like Paul was saying, it was really, really unique and really did stand out. My kind of background in coffee comes from a very kind of washed, heavy place. And definitely before I started at COE, anaerobic coffees and even naturals in general were not something that I particularly enjoyed. But this coffee, for flavor descriptors, the first time I tasted it, I had watermelon Jolly Rancher, peach, rose, and one of the most notable things, both rounds tasting this coffee, was the incredible long, sweet finish. I feel like this coffee in particular, compared to some of the other anaerobics that I've tasted, this one was so clean, which I really enjoyed. Some of the other ones that I've experienced have like a really lactic-y yogurt flavor that is not my cup of tea when it comes to tasting coffee. Both times I cupped it, things that were remarkable to me were kind of that watermelon Jolly Rancher aspect and just how long and sweet the finish of this coffee was.
Oh, great. Erwin, did you want to contribute a little bit about this? If you have your recollection of number 12?
Well, what I wanted to contribute was something a little different than my descriptors on it. I don't know if you want to do that now or later.
Oh, no, please. Yeah, it's pretty open form. Yeah.
Okay. No, basically, I asked my son, Erwin, to join this call. You know, we've been experimenting with anaerobic processes, since 2015. My son basically took over this and has been playing around with it, since then. We sent some samples over to Paul a couple of years ago, I think, for him to try out the different processes that we had done. Something that I think as analysts would need to figure out or understand is the chemical process of the anaerobic process itself. In doing that, I think it will give you a better understanding how to grade it, qualify it, or however you want to call it. But basically, when you do anaerobic processes, you're trying to take out oxygen out of the equation. Oxygen is really what grades coffee. So when you take out the oxygen in the anaerobic process, the coffee itself will start producing CO2, and that's why if you do it correctly, in reality, you don't need to inject CO2 into it, like with a carbonic maceration. But when you take out the oxygen and the coffee itself starts producing CO2, you have no acetic acid being formed. So I think that's one of the major things you have to look at a good anaerobic process coffee is that you have no sourness or acidic acids in there. Alex said that what he picks up in most anaerobic fermentation coffees is the lactic yogurt flavor. Well, when you take out the acidic acid out of it, the only bacteria that can really start being produced in that environment is that lactic acid, or Cactus bacillus, whatever the bacteria is called. My son might be able to explain a little bit more on that. But that is why you have a lot more of those flavor profiles. In layman terms, the way I'd like to explain it is basically when you have a good anaerobic process coffee, is you're not tasting that heavy process like Paul calls it. You're not picking up that pulp. You're not picking up that pulp degradation. Like whenever you approach a wet mill, and they have that pulp stored on one side, and it just reeks. You don't pick up anything like that. You're picking up a lot more of the subtle attributes in a coffee. Normally it's much sweeter, because whenever you do have all these chemical reactions happening outside of the oxygen, you have more contact of the sugars to the coffee beans, thus giving you more sweetness and more flavor attributes in the coffee. So I'm, like I said, my son could probably go into further detail more on the chemical side of it. He's been looking at it with my father and some other chemical professors there. If he recalls that experiment, that cuppings that he did, for us, a couple of years back, he's more than welcome to share them, his findings, what it were, basically the same coffee and the 3 different processes, even the different varieties, and how, those were being handled.
Great. I'm just looking at some of the chats here. Maybe it would be a good time now to have Adam and Testy Coffee talk a little bit about the lot itself. And we were kind of curious about the variety and the specific washing station and the process. If you would kind of walk us through. And once again, congratulations on winning. And yeah, we would just love to hear from you. We're really excited to have you join us on this call today.
Thank you so much. I want to say thank you to all you guys for letting us be here and share our story. Coffee is actually from Sidamo, Bombay, and the red cherries were selected from TAZA's farm, which is in Bombay. Maybe I can take off.
Sure.
I would love to hear from Scott. He said that he could possibly share some of the language that the World Coffee events use to find these coffees. Unless
Yeah, I put it in the chat for you guys. You can see it there too. I mean, it's the same issues everybody is dealing with as far as where's the line, how do we draw it, but still allow for innovation. And it's an ongoing conversation. You know, everyone wants to foster innovation. Nobody wants to tamp it down, but how do we account for it? And that's one of the reasons I was curious about what people were scoring, how they were describing the experience, how consistent were the scoring, not just in general, but compartmentalized. You know, one of the efforts for standardizing a good unbiased cupper is to compartmentalize your scoring, right? To think about each thing individually and where do you put this experience, you know? And it sounds like a lot, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like a lot of your experience was in flavor, maybe in sweetness, and maybe aftertaste, right? So maybe those scores were higher for that experience, but that still leaves you the other categories to think about and how they connect to the entire experience. This is something that we're always trying to train cuppers to do, and is one of those things that you have to continually practice, and could help us come to some idea of what is the primary thing. And what I liked about what you said was you started with the idea, well, you started with flavor, but then you went right to clean and sweet, right? Like those two things that we have Paul to thank for reminding us over and over and over are the most important things that we're looking for in coffee. And then you can put the uniqueness in where it belongs, you know, maybe it belongs mostly in flavor, that kind of thing. This is something that, just like hybrids, we're going to have to keep thinking about, you know, what are people going to do with these coffees? To be able to account for them means we have to be able to agree on how we're going to evaluate them. So I know that's why we're here, and I'm just trying to find some basis for where you guys started. That was my main point of that question.
I mean, yeah, I think kind of your question is where we started, just trying to find this like common ground on it. And, you know, maybe that kind of perfectly leads us into this other point that we were talking about the other day, which is, you know, what are the best practices that we can think of for scoring these coffees, and what should we be looking at? And you know, when you guys are head judging and when we're on these juries, should we be looking for kind of overall consensus in scoring, or should we leave more room for people, I guess, you know, people who can't stand it and hate it and score it low, or you know, people who just love this style of coffee and score it high? Is it good to have this range of scores, or should we all, you know, as head judges and COE cuppers and coffee professionals, be saying no, it's good, it's acceptable? You know, and I think that was something that you know, Paul definitely had some really interesting comments on the other day.
I think just real quick for me, this is a constant battle of how much are we trying to both educate and calibrate a group, as opposed to, or in relation to is probably a better word, getting the correct score or the most accurate score we can for that experience. You know, and it all comes down to time and effort. Do we have time to make sure, do we have to put in the effort that it would take to get a more consistent agreement on an experience? Or do we hit a certain point where we just have to let it go, and then it becomes people's biased, because you're going to have some bias no matter what. So you're trying to account for bias, you're trying to minimize bias, but how much time do you have to spend to make sure that we're as calibrated as possible, or as consistent as possible? And maybe even more important, because that's kind of what you're leading up to, right? How varied are our reactions to a coffee?